In the heart of a bustling city, where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and streets buzzed with life, lived Victoria Lane, a woman whose name had become synonymous with success, resilience, and generosity. She wasn't just any billionaire. She was a self-made one who had risen from humble beginnings to build an empire. Her journey started in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of town, where dreams often died before they could take flight. But Victoria was different. From a young age, she showed an insatiable curiosity for technology and a relentless drive to create something meaningful. Victoria's rise to fame began when she developed an app that revolutionized how people accessed affordable healthcare services. It didn't stop there. With every milestone she achieved, she poured her wealth back into communities that needed it most, funding schools, supporting local entrepreneurs, and even building shelters for the homeless. Her work earned her admiration not only from those who benefited directly, but also from people around the world who saw her as a beacon of hope. Despite her immense success, Victoria never lost touch with her roots. She believed that no matter how high you climbed, staying grounded was essential. So even after becoming one of the richest women in the country, she continued to visit the places where her journey began. These visits weren't about publicity or photo opportunities, they were personal. They reminded her why she worked so hard and kept her connected to the struggles many still faced daily. One evening, Victoria found herself hosting yet another charity gala, an event designed to raise funds for underprivileged youth pursuing careers in science and technology. The venue sparkled with elegance. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, soft music played in the background, and guests mingled over hors d'oeuvre. Yet amidst all the glamour, Victoria felt a strange sense of unease. Perhaps it was the weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders, or simply the fatigue of constantly being on. Whatever it was, she decided she needed some fresh air. Instead of calling her chauffeur to escort her home, Victoria opted for a quiet walk. There was something soothing about wandering through the city at night, away from prying eyes and constant demands. As she stepped outside, the cool breeze greeted her like an old friend. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and began strolling down the sidewalk, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. To anyone passing by, she might have looked like just another person enjoying the evening, but inside, her mind raced with thoughts of projects waiting to be completed and lives waiting to be changed. Unbeknownst to Victoria, fate had other plans for her that night. Across the street, Officer James Cartwright sat in his patrol car, scanning the area with disinterest. He'd been on the force for over 2 decades, and while he once took pride in protecting his community, those feelings had long since faded. Over time, Cartwright had developed a reputation for being difficult. His colleagues described him as abrasive, while citizens whispered about his tendency to target individuals based on their appearance. Complaints about racial profiling followed him like shadows, but nothing ever stuck. His superiors turned a blind eye, valuing his years of service more than addressing allegations against him. That night, Cartwright's shift seemed uneventful, until he spotted Victoria walking alone. At first glance, she appeared out of place, a well-dressed woman in an otherwise ordinary part of town. Without giving it much thought, Cartwright assumed she didn't belong there. His mind immediately jumped to conclusions fueled by stereotypes rather than facts. He parked his car nearby and approached her, his demeanor already hardened by preconceived notions. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "Can I see your ID?" Victoria paused mid-step, surprised by the sudden interruption. Turning toward him, she smiled politely. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. Cartwright frowned. "I'm asking the questions here," he replied curtly. "Why are you in this neighborhood? What's your business?" It was clear to Victoria that this wasn't a routine check, it was suspicion rooted in bias. Determined not to let his attitude rattle her, she responded evenly. "I'm simply taking a walk. Is there a law against that?" Her composure only irritated Cartwright further. Used to compliance, he bristled at her defiance. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "If you're not doing anything wrong, then show me your ID." Victoria hesitated, weighing her options. She knew her rights and understood that unless she was suspected of committing a crime, she wasn't legally obligated to comply. But standing there, facing the steely gaze of someone who clearly judged her based on skin color, she felt a surge of frustration. Why should she have to prove herself innocent when she hadn't done anything wrong? As tensions escalated, neither Victoria nor Cartwright realized they weren't entirely alone. A block away, hidden behind a parked car, stood Marcus Reed, the newly elected mayor of the city. Reed had been walking home after a long day of meetings when he noticed the commotion unfolding between the officer and the woman. Intrigued, he stopped to observe, his instincts telling him this wasn't going to end well. Reed had campaigned on a platform of reform, promising to tackle issues like systemic racism and police brutality head-on. Now, watching Cartwright's behavior, he saw firsthand the very problems he'd vowed to address. His heart sank as he recognized the woman being harassed. It was Victoria Lane, a figure he deeply respected for her contributions to society. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman who had dedicated her life to uplifting others, now being treated as a suspect because of the color of her skin. With each passing moment, Reed debated what to do. Should he intervene directly? Or should he document the incident to ensure accountability later? Ultimately, he chose the latter, pulling out his phone to record the interaction discreetly. Little did Victoria know, help was closer than she realized, and the events about to unfold would ripple far beyond that quiet street corner. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test courage, expose prejudice, and ignite a movement. As the tension between Victoria and Officer Cartwright escalated, the atmosphere grew thick with unease. The street, once quiet and unassuming, now felt like the epicenter of a storm brewing beneath the surface. Victoria stood her ground, her calm demeanor masking the frustration bubbling inside her. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being interrogated in a tone that bordered on hostility. Cartwright, on the other hand, seemed to grow more agitated by the second. His initial suspicion had morphed into outright irritation, fueled by Victoria's refusal to comply without justification. He wasn't used to being questioned or challenged, especially not by someone he perceived as out of place. To him, this woman, dressed impeccably and exuding confidence, didn't belong in this part of town. His mind raced with assumptions, none of which were based on facts. Instead, they were rooted in biases he had carried for years, unchecked and unchallenged. "Look," Cartwright barked, stepping closer to Victoria. "If you've got nothing to hide, then show me your ID. It's a simple request." Victoria crossed her arms, her posture firm but composed. "Officer, I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm asking for clarity. Why am I being stopped? Is there a specific reason?" Her words struck a nerve. Cartwright's face reddened, his jaw tightening as he clenched his teeth. "You're being stopped because I say so. That's all the reason you need." The absurdity of his response hit Victoria like a punch to the gut. How could this man, a representative of law enforcement, justify treating her this way? She took a deep breath, reminding herself to remain calm. Losing her temper wouldn't help. It would only give him more ammunition to justify his behavior. But inside, her heart pounded with a mix of anger and disbelief. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. "I'm not showing you my ID until you provide a valid reason," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I know my rights, officer, and unless you can articulate probable cause, I don't have to comply." Cartwright's eyes narrowed. Her knowledge of the law caught him off guard, but instead of backing down, it pushed him further into aggression. In his mind, her refusal was defiance, a challenge to his authority. He couldn't let that slide. Not here, not now. His pride, and perhaps something deeper, uglier, demanded he assert dominance. Without warning, Cartwright reached out and grabbed Victoria's arm, yanking her toward him. The sudden movement startled her, and for a moment she stumbled. Panic surged through her veins, but she quickly regained her footing. Before she could react, Cartwright shoved her backward. Causing her to lose balance entirely, she fell hard onto the pavement. the impact jarring her body and knocking the wind out of her lungs. For a split second, everything went silent. The world around them seemed to freeze, as if time itself had paused to process what had just happened. Then slowly, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Victoria lay on the ground, her coat splayed around her hands braced against the cold concrete. Pain shot through her side where she'd landed, but it was nothing compared to the shock coursing through her system. How had this escalated so quickly? How had a routine walk turned into an assault? Cartwright loomed over her, his expression a mixture of triumph and disdain. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before mouthing off to an officer," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. But Victoria wasn't one to stay down for long. Summoning every ounce of strength she possessed, she pushed herself up, wincing as she straightened her posture. Her knees stung from the fall, and her palms were scraped raw, but she refused to let the pain weaken her resolve. Looking Cartwright directly in the eye, she spoke with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "You just made a huge mistake," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Cartwright scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "I don't care who you are. You're just another troublemaker to me." His dismissive attitude only fueled Victoria's determination. She knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was bigger than that. This wasn't simply an isolated incident of abuse of power. It was a reflection of systemic issues that needed to be addressed. And she was going to make sure the world saw exactly what had happened here tonight. Unbeknownst to both of them, Marcus Reed, the mayor, was still watching from his vantage point behind the parked car. What he witnessed next solidified his decision to act. As Cartwright continued to berate Victoria, Reed quietly pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Within minutes, backup arrived. Not just police reinforcements, but also members of the press who had been tipped off by Reed himself. Flashing lights illuminated the scene as cameras rolled, capturing every detail of the unfolding drama. By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some people gasped in horror at the sight of Victoria on the ground, while others muttered angrily under their breath. A few brave souls stepped forward demanding answers from Cartwright, but he ignored them, his focus solely on Victoria. "Get up," he ordered gruffly. "We're taking you downtown." Victoria didn't move. She stood tall, her gaze locked onto his. "No, we're not," she replied firmly. "This ends here. Right now." Her defiance surprised even herself. Despite the fear and pain she felt, she refused to back down. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly. If she let this moment pass without fighting back, she knew she'd regret it for the rest of her life. As the crowd grew louder and the flashing lights intensified, Cartwright began to realize the gravity of his actions. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. But it was too late to undo what had been done. The damage was already set in motion, and soon, the entire city, and perhaps the nation, would bear witness to the truth. What started as a quiet evening stroll had spiraled into something far greater. Little did anyone know, this single incident would spark a chain reaction of events that would reverberate far beyond the confines of that darkened street corner. As the chaos unfolded on the dimly lit street, Marcus Reed, the newly elected mayor, remained hidden behind the parked car, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He had seen enough. The video footage he'd captured was damning, and the crowd growing around Victoria and Cartwright only added fuel to the fire. But Reed knew that simply stepping in at that moment wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just a personal attack on Victoria. It was a reflection of deeper systemic issues that plagued not just the city, but the entire nation. If handled correctly, this could be a turning point, a catalyst for real change. Reed's phone buzzed in his hand as he scrolled through his contacts, debating whom to call first. His finger hovered over the name of the police chief before moving to the press liaison. Finally, he settled on both. With swift precision, he dialed the numbers one after another, issuing calm yet urgent instructions. "Get down here now," he said firmly, "and bring cameras. This is going to be big. Within minutes, the scene transformed from a tense confrontation into something resembling organized chaos. Police cruisers arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the street. Reporters followed closely behind, microphones in hand and cameras rolling. The sudden influx of attention caught Cartwright off guard. For a moment he froze, his earlier bravado faltering under the weight of scrutiny. He glanced around nervously, realizing too late that this incident wasn't going to disappear quietly into the night. Meanwhile, Victoria stood tall despite her injuries. Her knees throbbed, and her palms stung from the scrapes, but she refused to let physical pain overshadow her resolve. As reporters approached, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this was her chance, not just to defend herself, but to shine a light on the injustices so many others had faced silently. She locked eyes with Reed, who gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You're not alone. Ms. Lane," one reporter called out, shoving a microphone toward her. "Can you tell us what happened here tonight?" Victoria hesitated briefly, collecting her thoughts. Then, with clarity and poise, she began speaking. "I was taking a walk, an ordinary, peaceful walk, when I was stopped by Officer Cartwright without cause. When I asked for justification, I was met with hostility and aggression. What happened next is something no one should ever have to endure." Her words resonated deeply with those listening. Some nodded in agreement, while others whispered among themselves about similar experiences. A young woman standing nearby stepped forward, tears welling up in her eyes. "This happens all the time," she said softly. "People like me were treated like criminals just for existing." The sentiment echoed throughout the crowd, creating a shared sense of solidarity. Strangers exchanged knowing looks, united by the understanding that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that needed to end. Cartwright, sensing the tide turning against him, tried to regain control of the situation. "Listen," he snapped, addressing the reporters. "She resisted lawful orders. I was doing my job." His defense fell flat. Even some of the officers who had arrived as backup shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with him. They knew better than anyone how thin his excuse sounded. Resisting lawful orders? That claim would hold little water once the full story came to light. Mayor Reed seized the opportunity to address the crowd. Stepping forward, he raised his hands to quiet the murmurs. "Tonight, we witnessed something unacceptable," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "An officer of the law abused his position and violated the rights of a citizen. This behavior has no place in our city or anywhere else." The crowd erupted in applause, but Reed wasn't done. "We will conduct a thorough investigation into this matter, and we will hold those responsible accountable. But let me be clear, this isn't just about one bad apple. This is about addressing the systemic issues that allow such behavior to persist. As your mayor, I promise you that we will take decisive action to ensure justice is served." His speech struck a chord with everyone present. For years, people had felt powerless against the ingrained biases within institutions like law enforcement. Hearing their leader acknowledge these problems and commit to fixing them was nothing short of revolutionary. As the night wore on, the energy in the air shifted. What had started as fear and outrage transformed into determination. People lingered, sharing stories and exchanging ideas about how to keep the momentum going. Social media played a crucial role, with hashtags like "Justice for Victoria" and "End Police Brutality" spreading rapidly. Within hours, the incident became national news, sparking conversations far beyond the confines of the city. Back at the scene, Victoria found herself surrounded by supporters offering words of encouragement. One elderly man clasped her hand tightly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, "for standing up, for being brave." Victoria smiled, though her heart still ached from the ordeal. She realized then that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever felt marginalized or mistreated. By refusing to back down, she had ignited a spark that couldn't be extinguished easily. As dawn approached, the crowd began to disperse, leaving behind a quiet street that now bore witness to history. Victoria limped slightly as she walked toward her car, accompanied by Reed and a few trusted advisors. Before getting in, she turned to face the mayor. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "But this is just the beginning. We have work to do." Reed nodded, his expression resolute. "Yes, we do. And together, we'll make sure this leads to real change." With that, Victoria climbed into the vehicle, her mind already racing with plans for the future. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Across the country, people were watching, inspired by her courage and ready to join the fight for justice. The events of that night had set something powerful in motion, a movement fueled by hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest moments, light can prevail. The morning after the incident, the city, and soon the entire nation, woke up to a storm of headlines. Social media platforms buzzed with outrage as videos and photos of the altercation between Victoria Lane and Officer James Cartwright spread like wildfire. Hashtags like "Doesn't Justice for Victoria" and "Does End Police Brutality" dominated Twitter trends, while Instagram stories and Facebook posts amplified the story to millions. People from all walks of life shared their thoughts, many recounting their own experiences of discrimination or abuse at the hands of law enforcement. For some, it was a moment of validation. For others, it was a wake-up call. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, framing it not just as an isolated act of misconduct, but as a symptom of larger systemic issues. Major networks aired clips of Victoria's calm, yet defiant response to Cartwright, juxtaposed with his aggressive behavior. The visual evidence was undeniable, and public opinion quickly turned against the officer. Protesters began gathering outside police headquarters, holding signs that read, "Accountability now," and "No justice, no peace." The energy was palpable, a mix of anger, frustration, and hope for change. Mayor Marcus Reed wasted no time, capitalizing on the momentum. He held a press conference later that day, standing before a sea of reporters and cameras. His presence commanded attention, not just because of his position, but because of the sincerity in his voice. "What happened last night was unacceptable," he declared, his tone firm yet empathetic. "An officer sworn to protect and serve instead chose to harm and humiliate. This is not who we are as a city, and it's not who we strive to be." Grace outlined a series of immediate actions he planned to take. First, he announced the formation of an independent task force to investigate Cartwright's actions, as well as any potential patterns of misconduct within the police department. Second, he pledged to implement mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, emphasizing the importance of cultural sensitivity and de-escalation tactics. Finally, he promised transparency throughout the process, vowing to keep the public informed every step of the way. His words resonated deeply, earning applause from those in attendance. However, not everyone was convinced. Critics accused Reed of using the incident for political gain, suggesting his swift response was more about boosting his image than addressing real problems. Some even questioned whether his reforms would amount to anything meaningful, or if they were merely empty promises designed to quell public anger. Despite the skepticism, Reed remained steadfast, knowing that true progress often faced resistance. For Victoria, the days following the incident were a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, she felt empowered by the outpouring of support she received. Messages poured in from strangers around the world, thanking her for standing up and sharing their own stories of resilience. Friends and colleagues rallied around her, offering assistance and encouragement. Yet on the other hand, the emotional toll of reliving the event weighed heavily on her. She struggled to sleep, haunted by memories of Cartwright's aggression and the fear she had felt in those moments. Determined to channel her pain into purpose, Victoria threw herself into planning her next steps. She met with lawyers to discuss filing a lawsuit against Cartwright and possibly the police department itself. While she understood that legal battles could drag on for years, she believed it was necessary to hold those responsible accountable, not just for her sake, but for future generations. "If I don't fight this," she told her team, "who will?" At the same time, Victoria recognized the platform she now had. Her status as a billionaire and philanthropist gave her access to resources and influence that few others possessed. She decided to use her voice to advocate for broader reforms, starting with a series of town hall meetings aimed at fostering dialogue between communities and law enforcement. These events drew hundreds of attendees, eager to share their perspectives and brainstorm solutions. Victoria listened intently, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. It became clear to everyone involved that this wasn't just about pointing fingers. It was about finding ways to heal and move forward together. As the investigation into Cartwright's actions unfolded, details emerged that painted an even darker picture of his conduct. Internal records revealed multiple complaints filed against him over the years, ranging from verbal harassment to physical intimidation. Shockingly, none of these allegations had led to disciplinary action. Instead, they had been dismissed or buried under layers of bureaucracy. This revelation only fueled public outrage, prompting calls for accountability not just from individual officers, but from the system that enabled them. Cartwright, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. Once proud of his reputation as a tough enforcer, he now faced widespread condemnation. His colleagues distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. Even members of his family expressed disappointment, urging him to resign quietly. But Cartwright refused to back down, insisting he had done nothing wrong. In interviews with defense attorneys, he doubled down on his version of events, claiming Victoria's defiance left him no choice but to act. His arguments, however, sounded hollow when contrasted with the overwhelming evidence against him. Amidst the chaos, Victoria continued to inspire. She appeared on talk shows and podcasts, using her newfound visibility to educate people about systemic racism and the need for reform. Her eloquence and grace captivated audiences, turning what could have been a fleeting moment of fame into a sustained movement. One particularly poignant interview stood out, during which she addressed critics who argued she was making too much of a simple misunderstanding. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Victoria said firmly, her eyes locking onto the camera. "This was a deliberate act of prejudice and violence, and it happens every single day, to people who don't have the resources or platforms to fight back. If my experience can shine a light on that reality, then I'll do whatever it takes to make sure justice prevails." Her words struck a chord, galvanizing supporters and silencing detractors. Donations poured into organizations focused on criminal justice reform, inspired by her commitment to creating lasting change. Schools named scholarships after her, businesses pledged support for diversity initiatives, and activists cited her as proof that courage could ignite revolutions. By the end of the week, it was clear that the incident had transcended its origins. What began as a confrontation on a quiet street corner had evolved into a national conversation about race, power, and accountability. People who had never paid attention to such issues before were now actively engaged, attending rallies, signing petitions, and demanding answers from their elected officials. The ripple effects extended far beyond Victoria and Cartwright, touching lives across the country. As the dust settled, Victoria took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. Sitting alone in her office late one night, she scrolled through social media, reading comments from people inspired by her courage. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness but from gratitude. She realized that while the road ahead would be long and challenging, she wasn't walking it alone. Countless individuals were joining her in the fight for justice, united by a shared vision of a better, fairer world. And so, as the sun rose on a new day, Victoria made a silent promise to herself. She would never stop fighting, not until equality became a reality for everyone. Because in her heart, she knew that true change didn't come from waiting for someone else to act. It came from standing up, speaking out, and refusing to let fear silence you, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The trial of Officer James Cartwright became one of the most anticipated legal proceedings in recent memory. It wasn't just a case about an individual officer's misconduct, it was a referendum on systemic racism, police accountability, and the power dynamics that had long defined interactions between law enforcement and marginalized communities. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation each day as spectators filled every available seat, spilling into overflow rooms where televisions broadcasted live footage. Reporters camped outside, microphones at the ready, eager to capture any detail that might shape public opinion. Victoria Lane sat stoically at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her team of attorneys. Despite the emotional weight of reliving the incident, she exuded strength and composure. Her presence alone commanded respect. It was impossible to ignore the contrast between her poise and Cartwright's defensive posturing across the aisle. For weeks, prosecutors presented their case, laying out a meticulous timeline supported by evidence. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings, witness testimonies, and Mayor Reed's damning video recording. Each piece added another layer to the narrative, painting a clear picture of what had transpired that night. One of the most powerful moments came when Victoria herself took the stand. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, she recounted the events with precision and clarity. Her voice never wavered as she described how Cartwright had approached her without cause, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and ultimately assaulted her. When asked why she refused to comply immediately, she explained, "I knew my rights. I also knew that giving in to baseless demands wouldn't protect me or anyone else from similar treatment in the future." Her testimony struck a chord with everyone in the room. Jurors leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Even some of Cartwright's supporters shifted uncomfortably, unable to deny the logic behind her reasoning. But perhaps the most impactful part of her statement came when she addressed the broader implications of the case. "This isn't just about me," she said, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "It's about every person who has ever been treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. If we let this go unpunished, we send a message that such behavior is acceptable, and I refuse to live in a world where that's true." The defense team fought back fiercely, attempting to discredit Victoria's account and portray Cartwright as a victim of circumstance. They argued that his actions were justified given the perceived threat he believed she posed. "He was doing his job," one attorney insisted. "In situations like these, officers must make split-second decisions. Sometimes mistakes happen." But the argument fell flat, especially when expert witnesses dismantled the notion that Cartwright's behavior adhered to proper protocol. A former police chief testified about the importance of de-escalation and the dangers of allowing unchecked biases to influence policing. Another witness, a psychologist specializing in racial dynamics, spoke about the psychological impact of systemic racism, explaining how deeply ingrained prejudices can manifest in aggressive behavior. Together, these voices painted a damning portrait of Cartwright's actions, leaving little room for doubt about his culpability. As closing arguments approached, tensions reached a fever pitch. The prosecution delivered a passionate plea for justice, urging the jury to consider not only the facts of the case but also its wider significance. "This is your chance to say enough is enough," the lead prosecutor declared. "To hold someone accountable for perpetuating cycles of oppression and fear. To remind the world that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it." The defense countered with a desperate attempt to sway the jury, emphasizing Cartworth's years of service and suggesting that convicting him would unfairly tarnish an entire profession. Yet, their words felt hollow compared to the mountain of evidence stacked against them. When the judge finally instructed the jury to deliberate, there was a collective sense that the verdict would be historic. Days passed as the jurors reviewed the case, their deliberations shrouded in secrecy. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, daily, holding vigils and rallies to show solidarity with Victoria. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice over Bias" and "Accountability Matters" dotted the landscape, while chants echoed through the streets. Inside, Victoria tried to remain patient, though the wait was agonizing. She spent hours pacing, her hotel room replaying the trial in her mind, wondering if justice would truly prevail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their decision. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. "We find the defendant, James Cartwright, guilty of excessive force and violating civil rights," they announced, their voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. Wave of emotion swept through the room. Cheers erupted from Victoria's supporters while Cartwright sank into his chair, visibly stunned. Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she hugged her attorneys, overwhelmed by the realization that they had won. For so many people watching, both inside the courtroom and around the world, the verdict represented more than just a legal victory. It symbolized hope. Hope that change was possible. Hope that standing up could make a difference. Cartwright's sentencing hearing followed shortly thereafter. The judge spared no harsh words, condemning his actions as a betrayal of trust and a violation of the principles he swore to uphold. "You abused your authority and inflicted harm on an innocent person," the judge stated sternly. "Such behavior cannot and will not be tolerated." With that, Cartwright was sentenced to 5 years in prison and permanently stripped of his badge, a punishment that sent shockwaves throughout the nation. While the verdict brought relief, Victoria understood that this was only the beginning. True reform required sustained effort, and she wasted no time getting to work. Within days, she launched a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of police brutality and advocating for systemic changes within law enforcement. The organization provided resources for legal assistance, mental health counseling, and community outreach programs designed to bridge gaps between citizens and officers. Mayor Marcus Reed kept his promises too, implementing sweeping reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the police department. He introduced body cameras for all officers, established independent oversight committees, and mandated ongoing training in cultural sensitivity and conflict resolution. These measures weren't perfect, but they marked significant progress toward addressing decades-old problems. For Cartwright, life behind bars offered little solace. Once celebrated as a tough enforcer, he now faced ridicule and isolation from fellow inmates who viewed him as a disgrace to the uniform. Letters poured in from critics condemning his actions, while friends and family distanced themselves further. His fall from grace served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked prejudice and the dangers of abusing power. Meanwhile, Victoria emerged stronger than ever. She traveled the country, speaking at universities, conferences, and community centers, sharing her story and inspiring others to join the fight for equality. Her courage became a beacon of hope, reminding people that even in the darkest moments, resilience could spark transformation. By refusing to stay silent, she had ignited a movement, one that showed no signs of slowing down. And so, as the dust settled and the headlines faded, Victoria reflected on everything she had endured and achieved. She realized that while the battle for justice was far from over, the seeds of change had been planted. Together, with countless others standing beside her, she vowed to keep pushing forward, because in her heart, she knew that real progress wasn't made overnight. It was built step by step, brick by brick, until the walls of injustice crumbled entirely. The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond the courtroom, leaving an indelible mark on the city and sparking a wave of transformation that reached every corner of society. For Victoria Lane, the verdict was more than just a personal victory. It was proof that standing up could lead to meaningful change. But she knew the work wasn't done. If anything, the trial had exposed the deep-rooted issues within systems that governed people's lives, and addressing those problems required relentless effort. Victoria threw herself into her foundation with unmatched determination. The organization quickly became a beacon of hope for countless individuals who had suffered at the hands of unchecked power. It provided free legal aid to victims of police misconduct, offering them a fighting chance to seek justice. Counseling services were made available to help survivors heal from trauma, while workshops educated communities about their rights and how to advocate for themselves. What started as a small initiative grew into a nationwide movement, inspiring chapters in cities across the country. One of the foundation's most impactful programs was its partnership with schools. Recognizing that education was key to breaking cycles of prejudice, Victoria worked with educators to develop curriculums focused on empathy, diversity, and civic responsibility. Students learned about systemic racism, the importance of accountability, and ways they could contribute to creating a fairer world. These lessons resonated deeply, especially among young people eager to make a difference. Many students began organizing marches, writing letters to lawmakers, and even starting clubs dedicated to social justice, all inspired by Victoria's example. Mayor Marcus Reed, too, continued to push for reform, determined to leave a legacy of progress. His policies transformed the city's police department, making it one of the most transparent and accountable forces in the nation. Body cameras became mandatory, ensuring that officers' actions were recorded and reviewable. Independent oversight. Committees reviewed complaints against officers, holding them to higher standards than ever before. Training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, equipping officers with tools to handle situations without resorting to aggression. These changes didn't come easily. Critics argued that the reforms hindered law enforcement's ability to do their jobs effectively, while some officers resisted the new measures, claiming they were being unfairly targeted. But Reed stood firm, reminding everyone that trust between communities and police was essential, and that trust couldn't be built without accountability. Over time, the efforts paid off. Crime rates dropped as relationships between citizens and officers improved, proving that compassion and fairness weren't weaknesses, but strengths. For Cartwright, life took a drastically different turn. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison, he became a symbol of what happens when authority is misused. Inside, he struggled to adapt to his new reality. Once respected and feared, he now faced ridicule from inmates who saw him as a disgrace. Letters from angry citizens flooded the prison mailroom, condemning his actions and demanding he reflect on the harm he caused. Though some former colleagues tried to defend him, their voices grew quieter as public opinion shifted decisively against him. Cartwright's story served as a cautionary tale, not just for law enforcement, but for anyone in positions of power. It highlighted the dangers of letting biases go unchecked and the devastating consequences of abusing authority. While some sympathized with his downfall, most agreed that justice had been served and that his punishment sent a clear message: no one was above the law. As months passed, Victoria found herself reflecting on everything she'd experienced. Late one evening, she sat in her office overlooking the city skyline, scrolling through messages of gratitude from people whose lives she'd touched. A young woman wrote about finding the courage to report abuse after hearing Victoria's story. A father shared how his son wanted to grow up to be like her, a fighter for justice. Each message reminded her why she kept going, even when the weight of the fight felt overwhelming. Yet, despite the accolades and achievements, Victoria remained humble. She often said, "This isn't about me. It's about all of us working together to create a better future." Her humility only endeared her to people more, turning her into a global icon for resilience and advocacy. Invitations poured in from around the world, conferences, summits, and leadership forums eager to hear her speak. Everywhere she went, crowds gathered, hanging on to her every word as she delivered speeches filled with wisdom and hope. At one such event, a global summit on human rights, Victoria stood on stage before thousands of attendees. The room buzzed with anticipation as she stepped up to the microphone, her presence commanding silence. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "When I walked down that street that night," she said, her voice steady yet emotional, "I never imagined it would lead me here. I thought I was just taking a quiet stroll after a long day. Instead, I found myself face to face with injustice, not just mine, but the kind that so many people endure silently every single day." She paused, scanning the audience. "What happened to me that night wasn't unique. It happens to Black men, women, and children all over the world. It happens to indigenous communities, immigrants, and anyone deemed other. And if we want to stop it, we have to confront the truth. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of larger systems designed to keep certain groups down." Her words struck a chord, drawing murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Continuing, she added, "But I also know this: we are stronger than those systems. Together we can dismantle them brick by brick. We've already seen it happen. In our classrooms, in our neighborhoods, in our courts. Change starts with each of us deciding to stand up, speak out, and refuse to accept less than equality." By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause. a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Tears streamed down her face as she looked out at the sea of faces, people united by a shared vision of justice and equality. In that moment, she realized the full scope of what she had helped ignite, a movement fueled not by anger alone, but by hope, determination, and love. Back home, Victoria continued to pour her energy into her work, always mindful of the responsibility that came with her platform. She collaborated with other activists, entrepreneurs, and leaders to tackle issues ranging from affordable housing to criminal justice reform. Her influence extended beyond policy changes. It inspired businesses to adopt inclusive hiring practices, artists to create works celebrating diversity, and everyday individuals to challenge prejudices in their own lives. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they pointed to Victoria's story as a turning point, a moment when society collectively decided to confront its flaws and strive for something better. Statues were erected in her honor, books chronicled her journey, and documentaries explored the ripple effects of her courage. Yet Victoria remained grounded, focusing on the work rather than the recognition. In the end, her legacy wasn't defined by wealth or fame, but by the lives she touched and the changes she sparked. She proved that one person's bravery could ignite a revolution, that speaking truth to power wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And though the road ahead remained long and challenging, she never doubted that light would eventually overcome darkness, because in her heart she believed in the power of unity, resilience, and unwavering hope. And so, as Victoria gazed out at the city lights one final time, she smiled softly, knowing she had played a part in shaping a brighter tomorrow.